At my nephew's piano recital, my brother whispered, "Don't embarrass us by pretending you understand music." His son won first place with a piece I'd helped compose. During the award ceremony, I stood up and said, "Congratulations. Your uncle the janitor is really proud." The room went silent when I handed the judge my Juilliard degree. I, 34 never thought I'd be sitting in a middle school auditorium planning revenge against my own brother, but here we are. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same hands he mocked for pushing a mop had once danced across piano keys at Lincoln Center. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as parents adjusted their phones for recording and kids in formal wear fidgeted backstage. I spotted my brother near the front row, his perfectly pressed suit and condescending smile already grating on my nerves. His wife sat beside him, equally polished, both of them radiating the kind of superiority that money and status bring. My nephew appeared from behind the curtain, scanning the crowd until his eyes found mine. I gave him a thumbs up, and he smiled before disappearing again. The kid had talent, real talent, and over the past 6 months, I'd been secretly helping him prepare for this competition. What started as casual conversations about music during family gatherings had evolved into weekly sessions at my apartment, where I'd guide him through complex compositions and teach him techniques I'd learned at Juilliard 15 years ago. My brother leaned over and whispered something that made my blood freeze. He told me not to embarrass them by pretending I understood music, his voice dripping with the same condescension I'd endured for years. He reminded me that this was important for his son's future, not some hobby for me to play expert on. The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. I bit my tongue and nodded, letting him believe he'd successfully put me in my place. Inside, something cold and calculating began to form. He had no idea what was coming. The competition began with younger students, their small fingers struggling through simple pieces. I watched my brother's face, noting how he barely paid attention to the other children, his focus entirely on when his son would take the stage. He kept checking his phone, probably coordinating with colleagues who'd promised to attend this important family event. When my nephew finally walked onto the stage, the transformation was immediate. Gone was the nervous kid from backstage. In his place stood a confident young musician who commanded the room's attention. He adjusted the bench with the precision I'd taught him, positioned his hands exactly as we'd practiced, and began. The piece flowed from his fingers like water, each note perfectly placed, each phrase building toward the climactic moments we'd worked on for hours. I recognized every technique, every subtle interpretation we'd discussed during our secret sessions. The audience was captivated, and I could see other parents leaning forward, realizing they were witnessing something special. My brother's chest puffed with pride, and he began nodding to other parents as if to say, "Yes, that's my son." His wife started recording, her phone capturing every moment of what she clearly believed would be a victory worth sharing on social media. But I was watching the judges. Their expressions told the real story. This wasn't just good for a middle school competition. This was genuinely impressive by any standard. The head judge, an elderly woman I'd noticed earlier, was taking detailed notes and nodding appreciatively at particularly difficult passages. When my nephew finished, the applause was thunderous. He bowed gracefully, another detail I'd insisted on during our practice sessions, and walked off stage with the composure of someone who knew he'd delivered something extraordinary. The remaining performances felt anticlimactic. A few kids came close to my nephew's level, but none matched the combination of technical skill and emotional depth he'd displayed. My brother spent the time between performances accepting congratulations from other parents, basking in reflected glory while shooting occasional glances in my direction that clearly said, "See, this is what real success looks like." During the intermission, my nephew found me in the lobby. He was practically vibrating with excitement, asking if I'd heard how the piece sounded from the audience. I told him he'd played it perfectly, exactly as we'd practiced, and that he should be proud regardless of the results. He hugged me quickly before his parents called him over, and I watched my brother ruffle his hair while explaining to nearby parents how he'd personally overseen his son's musical education. The lie stung, but I reminded myself that patience would make the eventual revelation even sweeter. When they announced the results, my nephew's name was called for first place. The eruption of applause was immediate, and I watched my brother's face transform into pure triumph. He stood up, clapping enthusiastically, already calculating how this achievement would play in his social circles. His wife was crying happy tears, and I had to admit that despite everything, seeing my nephew's joy was worth the months of secrecy. My nephew walked to the front to receive his trophy, and the head judge asked if he'd like to say anything. He thanked his parents, his teacher, and then, in a moment that made my heart race, he mentioned his uncle who'd helped him understand the music better. My brother's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, probably assuming his son was just being polite. The judge then announced that she'd like to say a few words about the winning performance. She explained that in her 30 years of judging youth competitions, she'd rarely heard such mature interpretation of classical pieces. She noted the sophisticated understanding of musical theory and the advanced techniques that had been seamlessly incorporated into the performance. This was my moment. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the auditorium turned toward me. My brother's expression shifted from confusion to horror as he realized what was about to happen. I told the room that I wanted to congratulate my nephew and that his uncle the janitor was really proud of him. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my brother's sharp intake of breath, could see his wife's face turning red with embarrassment. Other parents looked confused, unsure why this simple statement had created such tension. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the leather folder I'd brought specifically for this moment. Walking down the aisle toward the stage, I felt 15 years of suppressed anger and humiliation fueling each step. The head judge looked puzzled as I approached, but she accepted the folder when I handed it to her. She opened it, and her eyes widened as she read. She looked up at me, then back down at the document, then up at me again. Finally, she announced to the room that she was holding a Master of Music degree from the Juilliard School, awarded to me 15 years ago, with a specialization in composition and performance. The silence stretched on as the implications sank in. My brother's face had gone completely white, and I could see him frantically trying to process what this meant for his carefully constructed narrative. Other parents began whispering, putting together pieces of a puzzle they hadn't known existed. The judge asked if I'd like to say anything, and I took the microphone with hands that were surprisingly steady. I explained that I'd had the privilege of working with my nephew over the past several months, helping him understand the deeper structures of the pieces he'd performed. I mentioned that the winning composition included several original arrangements and interpretations that we developed together during our practice sessions. I thanked the judge for recognizing the quality of the performance and noted that true musical understanding comes from passion and dedication, not from assumptions about someone's background or profession. I handed the microphone back and returned to my seat, leaving my brother to deal with the aftermath. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Parents approached me afterward, some apologizing for assumptions they'd made, others asking about my background and whether I gave lessons. My nephew was confused but excited, finally understanding why our practice sessions had been so effective. My brother and his wife left quickly, barely saying goodbye. I could see them having an intense conversation in the parking lot, probably trying to figure out how to spin this situation to minimize their embarrassment. Update 1. The fallout began the next morning. My brother called me, and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. He accused me of deliberately humiliating him and his family, of setting up an elaborate scheme to make him look foolish in front of people who mattered to his career. He demanded to know why I'd hidden my education and why I'd been secretly working with his son. I let him vent for several minutes before responding. I reminded him of every condescending comment he'd made over the years, every time he'd introduced me as just a janitor to his friends, every family gathering where he'd made sure everyone knew about our different stations in life. I told him that I'd never hidden my education. He'd simply never bothered to ask about my background before deciding what kind of person I was. The conversation about his son was more difficult. I explained that the kid had genuine talent and that I'd only wanted to help him reach his potential. I kept it secret because I knew my brother would have stopped the lessons if he'd known they were coming from me. His pride would never have allowed his son to receive help from someone he considered beneath him. My brother's response was predictable. He accused me of manipulating his child, of using his son to get revenge. He threatened to cut off contact entirely if I ever went behind his back again. The irony of his outrage wasn't lost on me. He was angry that I'd helped his son succeed. I told him that was his choice to make, but that his son deserved to know the truth about who had helped him prepare. I mentioned that several other parents had already asked me about giving lessons to their children, and that I was considering it. The silence on the other end of the line told me he was calculating the social implications of having a Juilliard-trained brother he'd been dismissing as irrelevant. Update 2. 3 weeks later, my nephew called me directly. His voice was small and confused as he asked why his parents had suddenly forbidden him from talking to me. He said they'd told him I was a bad influence, and that he needed to focus on his regular piano teacher from now on. The hurt in his voice was devastating. I chose my words carefully, explaining that sometimes adults have complicated feelings that have nothing to do with kids. I told him that I was proud of his performance, and that he should continue pursuing music if it made him happy. I avoided criticizing his parents directly, but I made sure he understood that his talent was real and worth developing. He asked if we could still have our practice sessions, and I had to explain that his parents had made it clear that wasn't allowed anymore. I could hear him starting to cry, and it took everything I had not to drive over there immediately and demand that my brother stop punishing his son for my actions. Instead, I told my nephew that if he ever needed advice about music, he could always call me. I reminded him that learning never stops, and that he should keep exploring different composers and styles. I suggested some pieces he might enjoy working on and promised that someday, when he was older, we might be able to work together again. The call ended with him promising to keep practicing, and I spent the rest of the day wondering if my revenge had been worth the cost. I'd proven my point to my brother, but I'd also lost access to a kid who genuinely loved music and had benefited from my guidance. Update 3. 2 months after the recital, I was surprised to receive a call from the head judge who'd presided over the competition. She introduced herself properly and explained that she was also the director of a prestigious youth music program in the city. She'd been thinking about my nephew's performance and wanted to discuss something with me. She asked if I'd be interested in joining their program as a composition instructor. They'd been looking for someone with both classical training and the ability to connect with young students, and several parents from the recital had mentioned my work with my nephew. The position would involve teaching advanced students and helping them prepare for national competitions. The offer was tempting, but I had to explain the family situation. I told her about the conflict with my brother and how it had affected my relationship with my nephew. She listened thoughtfully and then made a suggestion that surprised me. She proposed that I join the program anyway, and that if my nephew ever wanted to audition for their advanced track, they would consider him based purely on merit. She noted that talent like his was rare and that family politics shouldn't prevent a gifted young musician from reaching his potential. I accepted the position, partly because I needed the creative outlet and partly because I hoped it might eventually provide a path back to working with my nephew. The irony wasn't lost on me that my brother's attempt to punish me had actually opened up new opportunities. The first day of classes, I was setting up my materials when I heard a familiar voice in the hallway. My nephew was talking to another instructor, asking about audition requirements for the advanced program. I stayed in my classroom, not wanting to create an awkward situation, but I could hear the excitement in his voice as he discussed the possibility of working with more challenging pieces. Later that day, the program director mentioned that a talented young pianist had inquired about auditioning. She didn't mention his name, but her description made it clear she was talking about my nephew. She asked if I thought family complications would prevent me from working with him objectively if he were accepted into the program. I told her that music transcended personal relationships and that any student who earned their place in the program deserved the best instruction we could provide. She smiled and noted that she'd hoped I'd say that. Final update. 6 months later, my nephew auditioned for the advanced program and was accepted immediately. The first time he walked into my classroom, we both pretended it was a coincidence, but I could see the relief and excitement in his eyes. His parents had reluctantly agreed to let him join the program after other parents convinced them it was too good an opportunity to pass up. My brother and I still barely speak, but the Cold War has settled into an uneasy truce. He can't publicly object to his son receiving instruction from a Juilliard-trained composer without looking petty, and I've made it clear that my focus is entirely on the music, not on family drama. My nephew has flourished in the program, and his compositions have started incorporating techniques that go far beyond what most kids his age attempt. He's never directly acknowledged our previous work together, but sometimes he'll play a phrase exactly as we practiced it months ago, and we'll share a brief smile of recognition. The other students in the program have no idea about the family connection, and I prefer it that way. Here, I'm just their composition instructor, someone who helps them understand how music works and how to express their ideas through sound. My brother's opinion of my profession has become irrelevant in this space, where talent and knowledge matter more than social status. Last week, my nephew performed one of his original compositions at a student showcase. As I listened to the piece unfold, I recognized elements we discussed during our secret sessions, now evolved and transformed into something entirely his own. The pride I felt had nothing to do with revenge or family politics. It was the pure satisfaction of watching a gifted student grow into their potential. After the performance, my brother approached me in the lobby. For a moment, I thought he might finally acknowledge what had really happened, might admit that his assumptions about me had been wrong. Instead, he simply said that his son was doing well in the program and walked away. But my nephew lingered behind, and as the crowd dispersed, he quietly thanked me for everything I'd taught him. He said he understood now why music had always felt like a language he was meant to speak, and that having someone who really understood that language had made all the difference. I told him that the music had always been inside him. I'd just helped him find the words. As I packed up my materials that night, I realized that my revenge had evolved into something I hadn't expected. I'd set out to humiliate my brother, to prove that his assumptions about me were wrong. But somewhere along the way, it had become about something larger. The importance of nurturing talent wherever you find it, regardless of where it comes from or who offers to help. My brother may never acknowledge that his janitor brother is also a trained musician, but that's his loss. I've found my place in a world where music matters more than job titles, where a student's potential is more important than their family's social standing. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working on new compositions for my students, I can hear echoes of my nephews playing in the melodies I write. The kid who started this whole mess by asking his uncle about music theory has become the reason I remember why I fell in love with music in the first place. The revenge I'd planned had been about proving my worth to someone who'd never valued it. What I'd found instead was a way to share that worth with people who could actually use it. And that, I realized, was a much better kind of victory.